All right, so let's continue. The parasympathetic nervous system. Again, this is kind of going to be a review of what we've already been talking about. The location of the preganglionic cell body is going to be either in the brainstem up here or in the sacral region down here. Okay, there's nothing in between. The exit is going to be either the cranial nerves, which makes sense if it's coming out of the brainstem, or the pelvic splenic nerves. Again, these are the nerves that are going out to the pelvic area. The ganglia. The terminal ganglia are either near or on the target organ. We just talked about the fact that you've got these ganglia that are literally just right there. Something that's interesting though with this, remember we talked about the divergence in the sympathetic nervous system. Here, there isn't really much divergence, little to no divergence at all. And if you think about it, that kind of does make sense. If my sympathetic nervous system's job when it comes to my digestive tract is just to shut it off, I can send one signal and get everybody to shut down. If I'm in parasympathetic, dinner. If I'm in parasympathetic rest and digest, though, I actually have to be able to control my stomach and my intestine and my liver and my pancreas and releasing enzymes at the right time. So having a finer control of that activity makes sense. Relative lengths. Well, we know that there's going to be a long preganglionic neuron and a short postganglionic neuron, just because of the fact that that preganglionic neuron goes from my brainstem to the target, and then my second neuron is already on my target. So there's no reason for it to be thousands of miles long. The enteric nervous system, like I said, is going to be a nerve plexus. Remember, plexus is just a fancy way of saying network within the wall of your digestive tract. And you do have the same reflex arc that you have throughout your nervous system. You have sensory neurons connecting your digestive system to your central nervous system. You have autonomic nervous system motor neurons connecting your central nervous system to your digestive tract. And you do actually have enteric neurons that are kind of confined to that enteric plexus. They're kind of internal controls. Just to kind of give you an idea, if you eat something simple, let's say that you have a Three Musketeers bar. Three Musketeers is primarily sugar. Digesting that isn't that complicated. And you actually have quite a few areas in your body that have sugar enzymes. So it's not that difficult to digest. You don't have to let it sit for a very long time in the stomach. No sugar digestion really happens in the stomach. So you can take it from the stomach to the intestine pretty quickly. However, if you have something more complex, like you have a steak with a baked potato and let's say a green salad, a lot of protein digestion is started in the stomach. So that meal would actually sit in your stomach longer. That's what these sensory neurons are about. What's in the meal? Where is it located? How do you respond to what's in the meal? And then you basically cause the movements according to what you have to deal with. Are you dealing with a Three Musketeers bar, or are you dealing with a steak dinner? Do not memorize this. That is not what I'm asking you to do. But I do want you to notice something with this picture. Notice that almost everywhere that one is, the other is. So if you look up here, I don't just have sympathetic, I've got parasympathetic. I don't just have sympathetic, I have parasympathetic. I don't just have sympathetic, I've got parasympathetic. They are basically touching the same organs. Again, one is an off switch, one is an on switch. Okay? So Distribution of the autonomic nerve fibers for sympathetic. Sympathetic axons pass from those sympathetic chain ganglia through three paths, and we've kind of already touched on this: the spinal nerve, the sympathetic nerves, and the splenic nerves. In order to get to their targets, they have to follow those nerves out. The sympathetic and the splenic pathways can actually join with the autonomic nerve plexus, that web network we were talking about. These are complex, they're interconnected neural networks. They are formed by neurons from both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sensory neurons can also contribute to the formation of these nerves. There's nothing to say that these nerves are exclusively carrying one type of information. It may be an amalgam of information. There are four major means by which the sympathetic axons reach organs. Again, spinal nerves, the head and neck nerve plexus, the thoracic nerve plexus, and the abdominal pelvic nerve plexus. So, spinal nerves, these are the ones that are coming out of the vertebra on your spinal cord, okay? The postganglionic nerves innervate the same structures as the spinal nerves they follow. You've got the sweat glands of the skin, the smooth muscle of the blood vessels of your skin and of your skeleton, and the smooth muscle of the erector pili muscles in the skin. Think about it. You get the kukui feeling, right? What's that boogeyman feeling gonna make you do? Get goosebumps, right? Oh, my hair stands on end. That's the erector pili. Somebody truly gets scared, the blood vessels in the skin all shut down and they leach all the color out of their skin, because I don't need my blood in my skin right now. There's a bear in my backyard. I need that blood going to my skeletal muscle. Same with my skeleton. Right now, I don't care about supplying blood to my skeleton. My skeleton's going to do fine for the 10 minutes that I have to deal with this bear. Okay? And the sweat glands of the skin. Now, I know you're probably going, why would I want to sweat? Okay, so let's say you're flipping through papers, right? And you're having a hard time getting a grip. What's the first thing you do? You lick your finger, right? You lick your finger so that you get better grip so that you can flip through papers. That moisture actually very intentionally gives you better grip. Having a little bit of sweat on your hands and your feet, not excessive, but a little bit, actually helps give you better grip. And if we're talking about us living, out on the Serengeti back in the day, having that little bit of grip may have helped you traverse rocks and stones on a mountain or grab onto branches of a tree. So having just a little bit of moisture there actually helps your grip. Now, the head and neck nerve plexus. Notice the same theme. Sweat glands of the skin, smooth muscle of the blood vessels in the skin and the skeleton, smooth muscle of the erector pili in the skin. Now we're talking head and neck nerve plexus. So it's not the spinal nerves anymore in like the torso area. Now we're talking up here toward our head. So it's the skin of the face, our iris will actually change the size of our pupil, and the ciliary muscles that change the shape of our lens will actually help us to focus better. Because let's face it, if there's a bear, I want to be able to see the bear and see where I'm running to. Okay? Thoracic nerve plexus. Okay. What happens to your heartbeat when you get scared? Speeds up, right? So you've got the cardiac plexus. That's supplying the heart in the thoracic nerve plexus. You also have the pulmonary plexus. What's pulmonary a fancy way of saying? Lungs. If I'm going to have to run from a bear, I better be able to breathe. And then you've got the rest of the thoracic plexus. Again, skin, sweat glands, bones, the skeleton, etc. Now, let's talk abdominal pelvic nerve plexus. There's a bear in my backyard. Do I care about digesting the sweet potatoes I had with my dinner? Probably not. So, I've got the celiac plexus. It's going to supply my diaphragm, my stomach, my liver, my gallbladder, adrenal glands, kidneys, testes, ovaries. Are any of these things important right now? Bear in the backyard? No. So pretty much this is going to try and shut this stuff down because I don't need it right now. The superior mesenteric plexus, it's the pancreas, the small intestine, the ascending and transverse colon. Do I need those things to survive a bear attack? No, shutting it down. The inferior mesenteric plexus supplies the transverse colon and the rectum. Do I need those things right now? No, so it's shutting them down. The superior and inferior hypogastric plexus. Now we're talking about the descending colon, the rectum, the urinary bladder, the reproductive organs. Do I need any of that? No. So all of these things are basically being shut down. I don't need to worry about digesting anything right now. I don't need to worry about making urine. I'm not really concerned about ovulating when there's a bear in my backyard. Okay? Now, looking at parasympathetic. Again, as far as exits go, it's either going to be the cranial nerves or the pelvic splenic nerves. And if you look and see it's coming from the brainstem or it's coming from the sacral region of the spinal cord, that makes sense. The branches supply organs directly, or they join a nerve plexus to be distributed to the organs. This is rest and digest. This is the one that I've got to have better control. So having these nerves go directly to these organs makes sense. There are four means by which parasympathetic axons reach their organs. We've got the cranial nerves that are supplying the head and the neck. The vagus nerve and the thoracic nerve plexus. Remember, vagus nerve was the one that had all of those branches into the thoracic and abdominal cavity. And the thoracic nerve plexus is going to be going into the thoracic cavity. The abdominal nerve plexus. What's in your abdomen? Your digestive system. And then the pelvic splenic nerves and pelvic nerve plexus. Again, you're talking about your bladder, your internal reproductive organs. So, cranial nerve plexus is supplying the head and the neck. You've got three pairs of cranial nerves that end at terminal ganglia where the postganglionic axons are going to supply the nearby structures. I've got the oculomotor nerve going through the ciliary ganglia, ciliary muscles of the eye and the iris. If I'm resting and digesting, do I need pinpoint pupils and do I need super focus? No. So they're just kind of relaxing everything. The pterygopalatine ganglia. Yes, I do realize there's a P there. It is silent. Like pterodactyl. You don't say pterodactyl. Okay? So the pterygopalatine ganglia. This is for your lacrimal gland, that tear-producing gland, the mucosal glands of the nasal cavity, as well as the palate. If you are running from a bear, there is a difference in the quality of saliva that you make versus when you're eating your dinner. Most of the time when it comes to us resting and digesting, if we're eating, we tend to make a very watery saliva that if we were running and breathing hard, it would evaporate too fast. When we're in fight or flight, we tend to make a thicker, more viscous saliva to keep our mouth moist. Okay, the vagus nerve and the thoracic nerve plexus. So this is going to the thorax and it's going to the abdomen. The preganglionic cells go through the vagus nerve to the thorax. They go to the cardiac plexus. If I'm in rest and digest, my heart slows down. I don't need my heart beating 1,000,000 miles an hour. The pulmonary plexus. I can kind of constrict my lungs a little bit. I don't have to take deep gulping breaths because I'm not running from anything. And it'll continue down the esophagus, and it basically helps to form the esophageal plexus. If I swallow, food goes down to my stomach. If you've ever been truly terrified or known somebody who's had one of those panic moments, they tend to vomit, right? And that's because this shuts down. So their esophagus isn't working. So the stuff doesn't have anywhere to go but up. The abdominal nerve plexus. You've got the terminal ganglia in the stomach wall, and it contributes to the celiac and superior plexus. Again, digestive system control. Those preganglionic cells supply the terminal ganglia in the walls of our gallbladder, our biliary ducts, our pancreas, small intestine, ascending colon, transverse colon, all dealing with digestion and making our digestive system function and move. The pelvic splenic nerves and the pelvic nerve plexus. You've got the preganglionic cells from S2 to S4, again, sacral region of your spinal cord. They pass through the ventral rami of the spinal nerves and enter the pelvic splenic nerves, which supply the transverse colon to the rectum and the hypogastric plexus. That means lower colon, the rectum, the bladder, and those organs of the reproductive system. Again, things that when we're resting, yeah, we want them to work. If we're in fight or flight, forget it, shut it off. But for now, yeah, if I'm just sitting here, sure, why not get my, I don't know, uterus ready for egg implantation? I know that's weird, just go with me on it. Okay, so the sensory neurons. When it comes to the sensory neurons in our autonomic nerve plexus, there is no such thing as a specific sensory neuron just for that. Really and truly, they're not strictly part of the ANS, but the axons do run along the autonomic nervous system axons within the ANS and the plexus. These are also going to be part of reflex arcs, regulating your organ's activity. They do transmit two things really well: pain and pressure. So when we talked about visceral senses versus general senses, we talked about the fact that with visceral senses, your internal organs, there are only two things you can feel: pain and pressure. You know when your stomach hurts, and you know when you feel bloaty, right? Those are pain and pressure. You're not going to feel touch. You're not going to feel itch or tickle with these because they don't transmit that type of information. When it comes to the cell bodies, they are found where all of the cell bodies are found for sensory, in the dorsal root ganglia. That's where every sensory neuron cell body is found. They can be found in some sensory ganglia of certain cranial nerves as well. But again, that makes sense because we do have those interconnecting points in our brain, not just in our spinal cord. So let's talk about the physiology. How does it work of the autonomic nervous system? We're going to talk about neurons and the neurotransmitters. They're called cholinergic neurons and adrenergic neurons. Okay? Cholinergic, adrenergic. Okay? We're going to talk about neurons specifically first, and then we're going to talk about the receptors, cholinergic receptors and adrenergic receptors. I'm going to warn you now, this is something that gets people every time. I will ask for cholinergic receptors and they give me the definitions for the neurons. So it's really important you understand the difference between those two things and what I'm asking you. So, what is a neuron? A neuron is a cell inside the nervous system that reacts to neurotransmitters and transmits electrical signal. This cell is a neuron and it takes signal from one end of the cell to the other end of the cell. The neurotransmitter is the chemical signal released by a neuron. Okay? It's a chemical that gets released, and it basically carries carrying the cell carrying the correct target receptor will respond to this. In other words, if you're not carrying the right lock to my key, I can't do anything with you. Okay? Now let's talk about the receptor. This is a receptor. This is a neuron. This is a receptor. A receptor is a transmembrane protein. It's a protein embedded inside the membrane of a cell, and it reacts to its matching ligand. In this case, in the drawing that I drew, it's going to be that neurotransmitter. Why am I harping? Because people miss points on something that should be simple. Know the difference between if I'm asking for a receptor that does that or a neuron that does this. Okay? So, in your autonomic nervous system, there are two primary types of neurons: cholinergic neurons and adrenergic neurons. What's the difference? What neurotransmitter they release. That's the difference. If you are a cholinergic neuron, that neurotransmitter you're releasing is acetylcholine. Cholinergic acetylcholine. If you are an adrenergic neuron, you release the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. Now, let me explain something. Adrenergic. Another word for norepinephrine is adrenaline, coming from the adrenal gland. So adrenergic is kind of a throwback to that. But the real name, the scientific name for this is norepinephrine. So if I've got an adrenergic neuron, its job is to release norepinephrine. If I've got a cholinergic neuron, its job is to release acetylcholine. Okay? Now, the receptors. Remember, receptor is another way of saying receiver. Okay? When it comes to the receptors of the autonomic nervous system, you have two types: cholinergic receptors and adrenergic receptors. Remember, receptor means receiver, right? So a cholinergic receptor receives acetylcholine. An adrenergic receptor receives norepinephrine. Okay? Now, something that's interesting with the cholinergic receptors, we actually have two different types. We've got ligand-gated receptors and we have GPCRs. So the ligand-gated receptors are also known as nicotinic receptors, meaning that something binds, these open. GPCRs are called muscarinic. And yes, believe it or not, nicotinic react to nicotine, muscarinic do not. Okay? So the muscarinic grew from Despicable Me. I've got my GPCR, I've got my minions. Okay? When it comes to the adrenergic receptors over here, they're always GPCRs. There are no ligand-gated receptors. So let's talk about that. The cholinergic receptors that are ligand-gated receptors. When you bind to those, it's always an excitatory response. Sodium channels open, you get an action potential. It's always excitatory. With the GPCR, the muscarinic receptor for the cholinergic receptors, it depends. It can be excitatory or it can be inhibitory. It depends on your target tissue. And I'll explain that better in a minute. But with a GPCR, even in the case of my adrenergic receptor, It can be excitatory or inhibitory. It depends on the target tissue. Activation can result in from the autonomic nervous system or from the endocrine system, because remember, the adrenal gland is going to be endocrine system. So here's parasympathetic, rest and digest. Here's sympathetic, fight or flight. Let's talk about what cells are where, because remember, we always have two cells in that path. In the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic cell is cholinergic, the postganglionic cell is cholinergic. So if I've got a cholinergic neuron, what does that mean? The neurons release acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter. If it is a cholinergic neuron, I'm releasing acetylcholine. In the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic cell is cholinergic, meaning it releases acetylcholine. But the postganglionic cell is adrenergic. So, common sense. You don't even have to memorize this if you use your common sense. When do you release adrenaline? When you're scared, right? Which would be in fight or flight. Yes? That second cell being adrenergic makes sense because it's releasing norepinephrine, also known as adrenaline. And if I'm in fight or flight, I'm gonna want to release adrenaline. Okay? So, I've got my preganglionic cells, I've got my postganglionic cells. Now we need to talk about receptors. Who responds to acetylcholine? Which receptor? The cholinergic receptors, acetylcholine, right? If this cell is releasing acetylcholine, I have to have cholinergic receptors there because they're the only ones who respond to acetylcholine. If I am releasing acetylcholine from here, I have to have cholinergic receptors here because if this cell is expected to respond, I can only respond if I've got cholinergic receptors. Literally, if I've got the acetylcholine key, the only lock that will react to it is an acetylcholine lock. So I've got acetylcholine being released. The cholinergic receptor is the lock that it reacts to or that it will bind to. Now, here's my effector down here. This is the heart, right? Rest and digest. I've got another cholinergic receptor. It releases, another cholinergic neuron. It releases acetylcholine. That means I have to have cholinergic receptors here. If I'm in rest and digest, what happens to the speed of my heart? Does it speed up or does it slow down? It slows down, right? So this is a muscarinic receptor. How do I know? Because the muscarinic was the only one that would slow down or speed up, right? Because it was a GPCR. So if rest and digest is going to slow my heart down, this is a muscarinic receptor that responds to acetylcholine by slowing my heart down because I'm in rest and digest. Good so far, I hope. All right, now let's talk about sympathetic. What am I releasing over here? It's what type of neuron? It's an adrenergic neuron, adrenaline. So in this case, I'm releasing norepi, right? I'm releasing norepinephrine. So the receptor that will respond to that has to be an adrenergic receptor. It is the only one that responds to norepinephrine. So I've got to have adrenergic receptors on my heart too. Now, we're in fight or flight. What should be happening to my heart right now? Should be speeding up, right? So having those adrenergic receptors, it makes sense that adrenaline would make my heart speed up. Yes? Now, just to give you an idea of the opposite effects, okay? Rest and digest slows down my heart. What does it do to my stomach? Speeds it up, right? Because it's rest and digest, that's when my digestive system gets going. If I'm in fight or flight, though, what happens to my stomach? It slows down. Pretty much, I try to shut it off because I don't want any energy going to that right now, right? So in this case, we have this speeding it up. My heart speeds up when I go into fight or flight, and when I go into rest and digest, it slows down. But if we're talking about a completely different organ, if we're talking about the stomach, it's the exact opposite, because in rest and digest, it should be active, and in fight or flight, it shouldn't. So again, we've got rest and digest, the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic cholinergic neurons receive a signal and release acetylcholine because they're cholinergic neurons. Acetylcholine binds to the postsynaptic neuron on its acetylcholine receptors, right? Or its cholinergic receptors, right? Now, that causes this cell to release its neurotransmitter, which is acetylcholine. It travels across the synaptic cleft and binds to these cholinergic receptors on the heart. Those cholinergic receptors, rest and digest, cause the heart to slow down. Preganglionic cell, now we're talking fight or flight. This is a cholinergic neuron, right? So, a cholinergic neuron releases acetylcholine, travels across the synaptic cleft, and binds to the cholinergic receptors in the second cell, the postganglionic cell. This cell, fight or flight, is going to be an adrenergic neuron, right? Adrenergic neurons release norepinephrine. That goes across and binds to my effector. If I put adrenaline in your system, what's going to happen to your heart rate? Going to speed up.